Every now and then a journalist manages to break the big story. And so today we had Tanya on a couple episodes ago, and at the end of it, we were talking about, what makes for the ideal podcast story. And we're talking about, and she goes, oh, Rooster Gate. And this is it. Today we are bringing the truth to the world. This is Rooster Gate in its raw, open, behind the scenes horror story. And what's really interesting about this story is it actually ends up with a criminal prosecution. And so as we're telling this story, the ending is really bad. It's even worse for the rooster, just putting it out there. The rooster, not a happy ending. But yeah, where this story starts and where it goes, totally bizarre. So Tanya Morrison, welcome back to EHO Knows, Rooster Gate. Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Shane. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, look, Rooster Gate by name. This is all about the story of one little noisy rooster, the rooster who could and did. The Rooster Gate is a bit of a play on, I guess, Watergate. It's an ongoing saga. This one was going on for many, many years until we finally got a resolution.
Yes. So today we're not going to mention where exactly it is. So there are papers on this story and it talks about the facts of it all, but we're not going to mention where it is because partially we want to talk about the personalities involved, and that's not covered in the paper, and we don't want to murky stuff up. But it is a fascinating story because it's not just about facts, it's about people as well. And so we're going to be talking about the people. So we won't name where it is, but describe where it is. Like, yeah, where did it happen? What type of street? Whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a city that has got mixed use, everything from in terms of your normal CBD areas and things. So we're going up into more the hills suburbs, into the residential areas. So when you start getting onto the outskirts of a city like that, then you get into your rural zones where you might see more homestay, semi-retired people with a few acres or hectares, a few animals, things like that. You're kind of borderline moving into the countryside. So this particular property is up on a quite a hill section, which is relevant because it's quite a rough cast section. If you think of a square, then the left and the top side of the square have got residential streets on both sides surrounding this property. Whereas to the right side and the bottom of the square, it kind of goes out into effectively bush, native land, grass, farmlands, areas that you probably wouldn't develop or live on. So, it's borderline on it's classed as a rural property in terms of district plans and zoning, but it's got residential literally between a wire fence. You've got a line of houses. And the property.
What makes that really funny though is you've got all these people you've got this person who owns the farm and they want to own a farm. And it's zoned rural. So they're doing what they want to do. Meanwhile, you've got neighbours and it's suburbia.
Yeah.
But the people who live in suburbia, like they've moved into a house in one sense knowing that there's a farm out the back. Also, in one sense, they're moving in there going, oh, look at this. We've got a beautiful view out our backyard of trees. And so it really is that suburbia and small farmland sort of property. Okay, so that's the starting point, that mix. And okay, so that's it.
Yeah. I mean, if we think of it as a square in terms of the property, knowing now that we've got two sides of residential and two sides that don't, the house for, the owner is kind of right in the middle of the square, but it's almost going down into a gully. So as we work our way back up towards the top edge of the square, if we think of it that way, as you're listening, then the property's going up. So the house is down, and then there's high trees right up on the top fence line, the top of our square of our property. And then that's relevant because being more of a free range property of reasonable size with animals running around, they're not all housed in this case chicken coops for roosters and things. They like to perch in the trees that are right up on that top boundary, right next door to all the residential houses. Whereas, the owner's house is actually some meters down, quite a fair distance, and they're actually down from it. So, Usually with noise, we joke about going up into the theatre seats. When if you go to the movie theatres, that's why it's all tiered. It's not just because of the better view, but the noise travels up. So the owner, also a rooster lover, not really bothered by the noise, but the people up on the top boundary with roosters free ranging up in the trees, looking right into the houses, absolutely huge tension between residential and a rural property.
And in the rooster's defense, it's doing what's natural. It's going for the high ground. It wants to be heard. It wants to be
Absolutely.
known.
Yeah.
And the farmer is either oblivious or happy with it, but it is now window level crowing. So that's the background. When did the complaints first start?
Yeah, so having we look back on records, this has been going on for years, a couple of decades. So records were going back to around 2006 onwards. So, for many a year, on again, off again, complaints would come in, noise complaints, noisy roosters, it's waking me up early in the morning, that's causing me all sorts of problems. My whole day's just thrown out. People loss of concentration, appetite, mood swings, you name it. We know the effects of disturbed sleep. Just ask a new parent, basically. You can't control when you're going to get woken up. It's quite frustrating day after day after day. And so environmental health officers would visit the property, try to see what's going on, talk to the owner. Is there anything you can do? Can you keep them in an enclosure? Can you put them in a coop? And on again, off again for years, we'd have this pattern of complaints would happen, we'd engage with the owner, it'd get a little bit better for a while, some more time would pass, another few months down the road, we're getting complaints again. And it was just a never ending cycle of up and down, up and down.
So, in terms of scale, are we talking about one vindictive neighbour?
Well, so that's the thing. I mean, over the years, we did have multiple people complaining, but, you know, getting into kind of the personalities here, you've all got to live there, right? So there comes a point where sometimes if you're going to get into a yelling contest across the fence or anything like that, it can make for very uncomfortable living conditions for people. So, whilst over the years there were a lot of people aggrieved by this, not many were willing to engage with the owner because you've still got to live there, and there was a little bit of fear of retribution potentially as well. Also, it's been going on for so long, they honestly have either learned to put up with it, rightly or wrongly, or are so frustrated by it they don't think anything's ever going to change. So what's the point? So it's quite
Yes.
interesting. Yeah.
But it wasn't a single vindictive neighbour. It was a string of neighbours over the years. So it started officially 2006. And so by the time this is coming to a head, we're now talking about 2018 is where the
Yeah.
pace really starts to pick up.
Yeah. So we'd looked at it.
So
Yeah.
2018, what starts to
We'd
happen?
looked at it then going, look, this has been going on for years. We've got to figure out a way finally to try and put this thing to bed or find some sort of a resolution. And look, one of those options on the table of a resolution could have just been throwing the hands up in the air going, look, there is absolutely nothing we can do. But clearly, for years on end, the educative approach, the formal letters trying to put the pressure on, you have to remember there's nothing stopping this person from owning a rooster. There's no piece of legislation to this day in New Zealand that says you cannot own a certain animal if you choose. So people might be thinking, just go and take the rooster off it. Well, you can't. You can technically seize.
This is literally a
Yeah,
farm. This is a farm, chickens, eggs.
correct.
That's what
Yeah,
farms
I
do.
mean, technically, if you think about noise law, you can seize someone's stereo when they keep cranking it up and having parties and annoying the neighbours. So technically, the source of noise can be seized. Now, if you were to seize it, what are you going to do with it? Because in New Zealand noise law, you can keep seized equipment. If we think of a stereo for up to 6 months, well, that's pretty easy under a secure lock and key. It's not easy to keep a rooster happy, fed, and watered, and in very good health for 6 months before you're allowed to do with it whatever you like.
And just putting it out there, if you do keep the rooster, you're not going to get any
No.
eggs. Like you're just going to cop the noise without any of the
Yeah,
benefits.
and
So yeah,
what happens to the
you
rooster?
just can't take a
Look,
rooster.
if the rooster has, I don't
Yeah.
know, health issues or, that's a real gamble. So it was never a practical option to seize the rooster, even though it's technically on the books as something you could consider. The reality is you're never going to do it. So 2018, we got quite a string of complaints coming through. So we decided to put noise meters out on timers at some of the complainants' properties. And So we put them out trying to hit that early hours of the morning because this is the time when people were complaining the most, going, "Look, I'm getting woken up here. Feels like the middle of the night." Sometimes it was. Could be anywhere from 3, 4 o'clock in the morning onwards. And once it's awake, rooster's going to town. So, we're putting out meters on timers, recording from like maybe a 4 till 7 a.m. period for 3 or 4 hours over different dates, collecting the data. And when you see the graphs, it's clear as day little clusters that are just spiking out of nowhere. And you play back the audio, and it's clear as day, this rooster's just going gangbusters on and off, on and off. Once he's awake, everyone's awake. So, then you've got to do something, haven't you? Because we've got a pretty clear evidence here of going, right, this is actually a problem. What are we going to do about it?
So we've now got proof that there's a disturbance. And so you approach the owner. What happens?
Yeah, so at this stage, we did approach the owner and we say, look, we've actually done some noise monitoring. We don't tell people in advance we're doing noise monitoring. We go to them after the fact saying, well, actually, we've had a complaint, we've investigated it, we've monitored, we've recorded, and this is what we've found. So, with the history of trying to work with the owner, sorry, and knowing that we're probably going to get maybe some short term relief, but not a long term solution, we actually ended up serving an abatement notice. So basically, we were trying to put a formal notice in place to say, you need to keep that rooster quiet. Failure to do that, if we evidence any breaches, look out, you're in trouble. So we served an abatement notice around July 2018, and it seemed to work for a while. We didn't really get any complaints. We didn't hear anything. What we think actually happened is that she actually just maybe culled the roosters or, did a bit of a cull. And nothing really flared up again until probably a good year later. It was around about August 2019 that it all started to flare up again. We started getting complaints.
So what's the owner like? let's just drag in all the stereotypes. What's the owner actually like? Are we talking about male, female, couple, older, younger?
Yeah, so it was a female owner, a small section, in terms of just had a handful of animals each, maybe a couple of dogs, a couple of sheep. So it was real kind of live off the land kind of thing. Having chickens, obviously rooster helps with that as well, but you're using the eggs, you're using the meat. She would use the feathers and weave beautiful Maori cloaks. So everything has a purpose, everything has a use. Wool from the sheep and things. She could spin that.
We're talking about the good
Yeah,
life sort of
yeah, living
experience.
off the land.
And I just demonstrated my age by quoting the good life. So that idyllic small
Yes.
farm. Yeah. So from their point of view, then that's a lifestyle that's being challenged and an ideal sort of dream. Were they friendly and outgoing, or were they defensive and hostile? Like, what was when you're talking to them? What are they
Yeah,
like?
we got a little bit of both at times because, it was kind of like, well, I'm allowed to have these animals. I choose to live this way. What is wrong with the way I live? Why do people keep complaining about me? Aren't they the problem here, not me? But then, of course, you show some evidence going, look, you've got some pretty noisy roosters here. Can you see how, even if it doesn't agree with you, some people don't want to be woken up at 4 a.m. by nature's alarm clock? And especially when you could do something about it, or we believe you could do something about it. So then you kind of got the attitude of, oh, well, yeah, but okay, but what am I supposed to do about it? What do you want me to do? So there was a kind of a,
Sunday roast.
well, yeah, joking, not joking, right? But it's like, well, what is practical? Because on one hand, you go, well, you try to keep a rooster contained when it's free range and perching up the top of a tree. You're not going to get it down, are you? It'll come down when it wants to. But on the other hand, we're like, well, do they need to be free range like that all the time? Or is there a way that you can build a bigger enclosure or a coop or something? And there's a bit of a balance there too, because you're also dealing with a personality who doesn't want to have her animals caged. She wants them to be free range because that's part of also who she is. So it's a bit of a delicate one, never nasty or anything like that to deal with, but you've really got to try and, I guess, win her over and just say, look, I understand where you're coming from. However, we've got to try and meet in the middle here and make the best of both worlds. How are we going to do that? But years and years of on again, off again, gets a bit better, flares up again, gets a bit better, flares up again. Like, we really had no choice. So the notice had to go on as it did in July. A year or so later, complaints flare up again. We make contact with her going, Okay, we're getting complaints again. What's happened? What's changed? Oh, I've got roosters back again. Because I need chickens, so I've got roosters back again. Fair enough. But now we've got noise complaints happening again, so here we go again.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting mindset though. I got rid of the roosters because of the complaints. Oh, I need chickens. I'm going to get roosters back. And so let's just forget about everything in the past and no one will notice. Okay. So 1 year later, complaints are up again. Now what happens?
So even though the abatement notice from the year prior technically was still in effect, it didn't have an end date. We decided that with a year passing, even though there was a big history, we needed just to monitor again to make sure before we do anything else. Look, potentially a new rooster we're dealing with, even though we feel like this is deja vu. Let's monitor again and just be sure. So we did some more monitoring, put the noise meters back out at the complainants' properties, throughout the rest of the year, trying to work with the owner. This is heading into towards the end of 2019. We had clear evidence again from a couple of different days. We'd put the meters out. These roosters going gangbusters again with the same problems here, the same amount of noise, the early wake up calls. We've got to do something. So it was actually rolled into early January 2020. We reissued the abatement notice and we kind of beefed it up a little bit at that point as well and got a little bit more prescriptive about you need to take what's called the best practical option to try and once and for all contain and keep these animals quiet because they are causing a nuisance. And if we evidence a breach, we will hold you to account with the breach. Yeah, and then roll on then here comes the next chapter after that. Now we've got a new notice in effect, and the complaints kept coming.
But then by the timeline, we're now rolling into 2020.
Yeah.
Which once upon a time would have just been, hey, we're just rolling over into a new year. But we're not. We're rolling over into a pandemic. And so now you're suddenly talking about people who are permanently at home and you've got a rooster. Did that complicate things?
Yeah, definitely. So, revised abatement notice in effect. We did some monitoring, I think, at the end of February, literally must have been a leap year. I think it was about the 28th, 29th of February. We evidenced a breach. So at that point in time, the laws have actually just recently changed on this, but a breach of the abatement notice was a $750 infringement. So that's what we could have been looking at there. But middle of March, we went into nationwide lockdown with COVID. So yes, now everyone's at home. So everyone's hearing the rooster, whether you want to or not. But we as officers, we're grounded as well because we were with our levels in New Zealand here, we had a level 4 lockdown. Whilst technically we were essential workers, the design of it wasn't for us to be leaving home at that point in time to deal with a noisy rooster. So we were still getting complaints. We knew that nothing had changed, but we're literally all grounded. And so it wasn't until a couple of months later when the COVID restrictions finally loosened that we did a second lot of monitoring, which was towards the end of May 2020, and we evidenced a breach again, which could have been an infringement, $750 again. But we looked at it at this point going, look, the abatement notice is in. We know COVID isn't ideal, but it actually doesn't change anything here. You've been given plenty of time over the years. Even this notice is, 5, 6 months now. We're getting breaches. We've got an option here. We either keep serving infringements, you either pay them or you don't. Courts could chase you there, or the debt collectors, whatever. Or we can take you to court once and for all. And so that's the decision we made. We're going to court. We've had enough of this. We're going to court.
So, first of all, $750 is a lot of chicken.
Yeah, it is right.
As a bloke, technically that's 75 cooked chooks from Woolies. But yeah, so it was getting to the stage where these roosters were going to be $750 effectively a pop every now and then. But you decided to take it to court. Now, the moment you decide to take it to court, do they have the option of backing out and just saying, look, we're going to get rid of these chooks totally? Or what was the path from that point on?
So it's an interesting question because the breach of the abatement notice is why we were going to court. I mean, yes, why was the abatement notice in place? Because you got a noisy rooster. But actually, the technical legal speak was you have breached an abatement notice more than once. So, You have failed to comply with a statutory requirement, a statutory notice that has been served on you. And that's what we looked at, was going, well, we can fine this person. They either pay it or they don't. It doesn't make them do anything. It doesn't make them solve the problem. And history would suggest that, whether they pay it or not, maybe they will, maybe they won't. We need the behaviour to change. The only way this behaviour is going to change is we've got to ramp it up. And the only option left is we're going to court. So I think it was about,
Yes.
yeah, about August by the time we got everything together and we laid charges. We, in terms of, filed it with the court, and yeah, we're going to court.
Anything like this happened in the courts before?
Never. To this day, it's a first and only in New Zealand. Yeah, it's worth a little Google there. And when it made the media headlines and things eventually, man, they had a field day with the headings. I think it was Cockadoodle Don't. There were some really great headlines. It made national media headlines, this one.
Yeah, there's so many
So
bad
many.
puns that, yeah, the media. And just putting it out there, we're running with Rooster Gate, as tempting as it is to do so many other titles. But yeah, I could just imagine that. So then that means suddenly this farmer is not just going to court, but suddenly getting all this national attention. What was the general media's response? Like, were they falling on the side of the farmer or falling on the side of the neighbours?
Well, to be fair, most of the media attention probably came out the following year after the actual court appearances and things were done. It got reported on, kind of the outcomes and what happened. They didn't really take a side too much. They just kind of called it down the middle and just said, this is what's happened. It's been going on for years. So they didn't really take a angle too much, which in some ways is good, because you're going to have people have different opinions on this, going, "Oh, leave her alone. Like, she's allowed to have them." It's like, absolutely, don't disagree. But would you like to live next door to that? Like, every single day, there is no day off here. It's not like it's the weekend and you don't have to get up and go to work, so you turn your alarm off. Oh no, this one will wake you up on a Saturday or Sunday. Could be 3 in the morning, could be 5 in the morning, who knows?
Okay, so the tail end of this is the fact that, yes, after the court case, that's when it really hit the
Yeah.
media. And so just as a strange repercussion as to, ultimately where it ends up. Okay, so court. What's the judge say? Like, you've got Rooster Gate being
Well,
opened up in front of you.
it was so, especially in hindsight, it's actually comical when you look back on it, going, wow, we were in environment court in front of a judge, literally in the courtroom, up in the witness box stand and everything like that. At the heart of it, we're talking about a rooster. This is the legislation in New Zealand, the Resource Management Act, where, if somebody dumped oil into the ocean, like the bad man did the really bad thing, like you're going after people, big contamination of land and whatever else, some real big bickies. But it's the same legislation that all our noise provisions sit under. So it is still environment court and you're still sitting in front of a judge, but you can guarantee that judge has never had anything like this in his life. So yeah, court was interesting as well because the rooster owner, self-represented. She didn't have legal representation, which was completely her choice. So we were there and we, had, legal representation and things there fighting this one on behalf of the council. And we're coming up against her completely on her own. So that was a wild card because you're allowed to cross-examine in courts, which means she could ask me on the stand anything, and she did. So that was quite interesting as well. But essentially, the judge wanted to know 3 things. He wanted to know, well, was the noise unreasonable? And if it was, then you're justified in serving an abatement notice. Did you serve that notice correctly? And if that was the case, that it was served correctly, was it breached? So the first comical moment of courtroom was trying to establish, was the noise unreasonable? So I had a audio clip that was 10 minutes long. That was from a recording we'd done at the complainant's address at some stage. I'd set the noise meter on timer to start at 5 a.m. Now, obviously, I didn't check in with the roosters first or anything like that. I just went off what the complainant was telling me. It's about 5 a.m. most mornings. So from 5 a.m. till 5:10 a.m., I had a recording with 42 crows on it, loud as clear as day.
Wow.
We started playing that for the judge in court. We got about a minute and a half into the recording, and he politely asked my lawyer how much longer this goes, to which she's pretty much elbowing me, whispering, going, "Psst, how much longer has this got?" And I'm like, 8 minutes. And I said, 8 minutes, Your Honour. And he said, put his hand up, said, I've heard enough. So that was easy. That was tick box number one. He didn't want to hear any more. He'd heard enough. I served the notice correctly. So then the whole crux of this came down to, was it breached?
Yes. So take-home message by mental health officers is just make sure you do your job correctly, because one day you'll be in front of the judge, and it's really just as long as you do your job by the book, everything's fine. There's a really awesome podcast, a couple episodes about if you ever rock up in court, what you have to do. So just a plug for previous episode. But yeah, so you demonstrated that there was a problem, demonstrated that you had done things by the book. And on to the last one, just doubling back to playing the recording in court. Noise is a really funny thing in terms of if it's the middle of the day now, there's white noise happening all around or whatever. And so if you hear something, it's not as loud as if it's the middle of the night and it's dead quiet and you suddenly just have this noise coming out. But in this particular case, you're talking about a judge who's sitting in a courtroom, so it's not a quiet environment in the first place, and he's listened to 1 minute of a rooster crowing, and he's going, I've had enough. And so,
Tells you how bad it was.
so in one sense,
Yeah.
from a prosecutor's point of view, that's your dream scenario where you're going, the judge cannot handle 10 minutes of this, and yet this has gone on for years. And so that's the starting point. And so slam dunk, was there a problem? Followed by, yes, we've done the paperwork, which then brings us on to the third bit. How did that pan out?
So this is where a bit of the fun started. So in drafting our notice, we'd asked her to take the best practicable option, which wasn't limited to, we'd given her 6 things. She could have done other things on top of that, but there was 6 particular things we wanted her to do. I'm going to come back to the first point because this is the kind of the sticky one. So I'm going to jump ahead to kind of 2 to 6 here, but there was a small chicken coop behind her house. So we'd said, look, you've got to try and keep the birds in there. You've got to try and blacken out the whole coop and enclosure as much as you can. We think that you should try and install some insulating materials in there to try and reduce breakout noise. We want you to keep the roosters in this enclosure between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. daily. We understand if you want to let them out through in the day, but you've really got to get them in at night. Make sure when they're in there, however you do it, it's got to be basically shut up shop, tight, blackened out, insulating materials, keep all the openings and things covered. So that was basically the last 5 points that we wanted to do. So when we were working through these one by one, the judge just said, well, how was the coop blackened out? And she said, well, I threw a tarpaulin over it, a big canvas tarpaulin or something. And he said, well, that would probably reduce some light. Okay. What's the insulating materials that you used? Did you line the coop with something? What did you do? Well, I'm remembering that she lives off the land. She had shorn a couple of her sheep and she'd hung the sheep's wool loosely inside the enclosure. That was her insulating materials. The rest of it wasn't so much, the solid door to fix on the coop and keeping all the openings closed. Because the judge then directed towards me and said, so you've asked the rooster to be in between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. Did you ever go and inspect her property between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. to ensure that the roosters were in there, the insulating materials were in there, the coop was blackened out, the doors were shut, etc.? And we said, well, no, sir, we didn't, because, there's also the element of being a warranted officer, absolutely. But to go onto someone's property for basically a nuisance complaint, you've got to do it within reasonable hours. I mean, it's not because I'm not interested in getting out of bed, but it's like, who's realistically going to go to a property between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m.? You're basically going to have to make an appointment or tell her that you're coming, because that's kind of polite. Or I'm going to rock up literally in the middle of the night to this woman's house on a farm. So we had to say on the stand, well, no, sir, we didn't. And he said, well, then you can't disprove that she didn't do any of those things. And wool, even if you don't think it was a noise insulating material that you had in mind, wool has insulating properties. That's quite well known. Even if it's insulating for warmth, your notice said insulating material. You didn't say noise insulating material. So those points are all proven, basically. You can't say she didn't comply with those points. And from that
Okay.
perspective, he was right. And we kind of sat there going, ooh, he's got us there. So it all came down to the first part of the notice. The very first thing we'd asked her to do was to move and house the roosters to the southeast boundary of the property. So basically move them as far away from the residential property. So if we think of our square again, with our left and our top side having the residential properties, knowing that the bottom and the right-hand side of the square is going out into basically bush and grass and native land, we wanted her to move them as far away from those residential properties as possible. So we wanted her to go to the southeast boundary. And that's the exact words that we used, the southeast boundary. So then we got into a bit of a bun fight over what is the southeast boundary. And that's where the fun started.
So how can you debate southeast is southeast? Compass will demonstrate that. Boundary is fence line. How can you debate southeast boundary?
Well, so the judge asked a really reasonable question, and he asked it to the rooster owner. He said, what did you think was meant by the words southeast boundary? Here's a map, aerial map of your property. X marks the spot. So I was on the witness stand at this point, and the court registrar brings the map over to me, gives me a pen and said, mark where you wanted her to put it. So I put a big red cross in the corner. So if we think of our square again, this is our bottom right corner. I put it right in the corner, as in as far away as possible. And that went back to the judge, and he had a look at it going, okay, I see where you've put your cross. And then so please go show the rooster owner. He said, did you believe that this is where the officer meant you to put the coop? And she said, yes. And that alone is what won us the case because, well, kind of. So the word we never put in our notice was the corner of the boundary. Because he said, well, was it the south or was it the east boundary? So if you think of your square, he said south could be anywhere along the bottom edge. East could be anywhere along the right edge. He said, you assumed corner, but you never said corner. You marked X marks the spot in the corner, and she agreed that that's what you thought that was meant, but you never actually told her to put it there, did you? Now, the fact of the matter is she didn't move the coop at all. It was still next to her house. So that's why we won the case. Because we couldn't prove anything
She
else.
understood the instruction and chose not to do it.
But if she had moved that coop to either the south boundary or the east boundary, we were toast. But she hadn't moved it at all, thankfully.
Yes. And technically, we're not. So we'll put the photo up in the video, but everyone else who's listening to the audio, it's not going to help you. But technically, we're not talking about just a rectangle that's nicely north, south, east, west. It does slant. So the southern boundary does go southeast as it goes down. So technically, if you were south, but at the west end, you're close to the residential. And if you go east, the further east you're going, the further southeast technically you're going. So it's sloping. And so because of that, yes, if they had moved it south just a fraction, they would have been complying, but still being
even though she hadn't moved it, if she turned around and just said, I didn't know what was meant by the southeast boundary, then we would have been in trouble.
Yeah.
So, it's funny how a day and almost a day and a half battling in court, and that's where we ended up. That's literally what cinched it for us in the end. She didn't move it.
Yes. It is a clever question, though. Put an X there. Would you, is that where you thought they meant yes?
Yeah.
One question. And so one question then led to what conviction?
So in the end, she did get convicted because the conviction was failure to comply with an abatement notice. Of course, it's a lot more fun to say colloquially that she, got prosecuted and convicted because she's got a noisy rooster, because really that's what it was all about. That's not what any conviction sheet's going to read. It's going to say failure to comply with an abatement notice under the Resource Management Act. The judge chose not to put any penalty in place. He could have fined her a lot of money, but what's the point? What he did instead was he actually put a court order in place. And we were allowed to have some feedback into what this might look like, but ultimately the judge had the final say. Essentially, it was a little bit of a tidy up revamp of our abatement notice with the correct wording in it this time around the specifics. And essentially, if there were more complaints received, we were expected to monitor. If we evidenced a breach, we come straight back to court and say we think she's breached the notice, and then basically that would be assessed, and heavy penalties, probably huge fines, would apply. So yeah, funnily enough, the court order didn't say she's not allowed to own any roosters. So she still has roosters. I believe the original rooster is no longer with us, so I think we've now got son of a rooster. But that's fine. And the thing is, we actually, touch wood, haven't had complaints since. And I think the reason we haven't is because the complainants know, hey, look, we were going at this for years. You know, from a council point of view, this was out of the box for them. Even they could see that this was bizarre for us to be going to court over this. But we did it. What else can we do? Seriously, what else can we do? So I think it's still happening, if I'm being honest. I'd be surprised if wasn't. But people know now that there's nothing more that can be done.
So in one sense, that's the bad outcome, where this rooster's crowing, there's nothing that can be done. Though technically now they're in a better position, because if you record it and you hear it, you can go straight back to court. And so in fact, they're in a better position. Yes. But then, yeah, it's been through court, and it would be interesting to actually talk to the neighbours and say, have you just given up, or has the problem actually disappeared? In one sense, it's a really good outcome, because you've actually had a successful prosecution. Like you said, this is normally reserved for people dumping oil and doing really, really bad stuff. Yeah. And so now you've actually had something that's as, in context, oil, as trivial as a rooster, and going, well, no, you know, if you're told to clean up your act, if the council is there telling you to clean up your act, the court will back council and say, no, this, you know, is a breach. And so it's a small win, but it's a powerful win, because it's reinforcing the powers of council, rather than going, oh, look, who cares? Let's just write this off. In which case you're going, well, why do we bother doing this in the first place? So small win, hopefully a powerful win.
Yes. You've got to look at it, though, after all of these years. I mean, you know, we got nothing out of that process, not financially. We didn't benefit from it in any way, shape or form, arguably, except, I guess, sending a bit of a message and having an outcome, a little bit of a resolution, a little bit of closure for those complainants, even though the situation practically might be the same as it was. You know, we actually followed through. And I tell you what, it was one out of the box. You know, we learnt a lot as we went. Now I can hand on heart say, if we were ever to go down this road again, we know exactly what we need to do in terms of proving the offence, even writing the notices to very specific language. I mean, these notices were drafted by, you know, EHOs. It had legal insight into it. But it's not until, you know, someone just asks you that question from a different perspective and you're just going, I never said the word corner. Why didn't I say that? I know what I meant. Thankfully, she knew what I meant, but I never said it, you know? So, yeah, it's good from a learning point of view, because I think we're always learning in this game. And, you know, this had never happened before. It hasn't happened since. So you haven't got any precedent to rely on. You're going off your intuition. You're trying to resolve and do the right thing. But ultimately, you've got to take it on the chin and just say, look, next time, I'm probably going to write that notice a little bit different.
I assume that the person involved was whatever the opposite of ESL is, English as a first language.
Yeah,
but so communication wasn't a problem. Whereas I know, like here in Sydney, we have a lot of, still within the Sydney basin, little farms, you know, blocks, and they tend to be migrants who are still just doing a little bit of farming for themselves. And so now language is a huge barrier. So for you, you thought you were both speaking the same language, clear communication, and fortunately in your case, they turned around and said, yes, we understood. What if this person had been ESL, or, you know, where English virtually isn't on it, and that question, did you understand what was meant? They could, hand on heart, say, I've got no idea what you're talking about. And then your case would have fallen out because, no, you didn't specifically say in the corner you weren't clear. So it's, in one sense, it's a problem that's going to become worse in the future because of who the offenders are likely to be. But then at the same time, you feel for all parties because in one sense, you've got a farmer who's just trying to live the good life and you've got neighbours who are just trying to live the quiet life, coming head to head because of urban planning. That's rural, that's suburbia. And
The planning issue is the
yeah.
thing here, isn't it? Because, it's not even who got there first, really, because this is what we see across the world. Cities growing up around the country and industrial areas, you've got houses opposite factories, and yet people's expectations of the quiet life, maybe if you buy a house opposite a factory, you should probably realize there's a factory there when you buy the house. By and large, farming kind of lifestyle block, you're going to say probably shouldn't cause any real issues. A lifestyle block is, very small. You're not likely to have the tractor ploughing the field. But then all of a sudden now you've got a rooster, so how many times would you actually see that happen? But there is a planning tension there because it's literally a wire fence that separates these two zones, and the zones have different requirements. So that's the other thing that's interesting is within the city, there's, keeping of animals bylaws, but they only apply to residential zoned properties, not to rural zoned properties on the other side of the fence, quite literally.
So the people making the complaint, it's illegal for them to own a rooster, but it was literally legal for their neighbour directly behind them to own a rooster.
Yeah.
So two totally different sets of laws with a wire fence in
So
between.
that's probably one thing that came out of this. So at the time this all happened, it wasn't illegal for anybody to have a rooster, even in a residential area. There was no bans or anything in place. So following this was a bit of a catalyst. When that bylaw came due for review again a couple of years back, then a permit system was put in place to essentially say if you're going to have a rooster in a residential area, you need to apply to have a permit to keep it. The permit will only be issued if we've never had a complaint about it, and that permit can be revoked at any time should we get complaints about it. 'Cause the reality is there'll be roosters all throughout the city, but if we never hear of them, quite literally, who cares? If you've got a track history or we're getting complaints, well, I'm sorry, as the letter of the bylaw says, now that it's been revised after this all happened, you can't have the rooster. But it doesn't affect rural zoned land. So even though that bylaw's change, it makes no difference to said rooster owner. If this all flares up again tomorrow, I really hope I haven't just jinxed that, then we're going to be in the exact same position, except for the fact that we're going to be looking at the court order that's still in place and whether she's complied or not.
Yes. So you said in hindsight, making sure documentation is clearer. What other things would you have done differently now in hindsight?
I mean, it's nice to say coulda, shoulda, woulda after all these years. Could we have done this a lot sooner? But, the reality is you've got to look at it from a council, perspective, ratepayer money and everything like that that goes into local councils. You try your best.
For the amount of money
Yeah.
spent on this, you could have given the farmer a lifetime supply of frozen chooks.
Probably. Yeah. And you got to look at it like you want voluntary compliance. We don't want to take people to court. We actually don't. It's not because of the time and the expense, but who really wins out of this ultimately? But we felt after all those years, we had no choice. And if you're not willing to follow through, then also what message does that send to your complainants about the process when there is a problem and the problem's not getting any better? So, on one hand, it's a really, really great outcome. On the other hand, there's so many things we could have done it a bit earlier, we could have done it a bit differently. Things like COVID didn't help, but we got there in the end.
So finishing up, it hits the media and you're talking about, is council ineffective in being able to follow through? And you're going, well, no, we do follow through and the court backs us, it now hits the media. Has it been a win or a loss from a general public perception point of view? Yeah, what do they now think of council from that point of view?
I think people will have differing opinions on it even to this day. And that comes back to whatever side of the fence you're on, quite literally, because again, this person, like anyone else, can own whatever animal they want. But I also think that you can't argue with the evidence in terms of how annoying and the nuisance that this was causing people and how long it had been going on for. If you were living next door to that, not many people would be able to withstand it at all. So, you know, our role here, rightly or wrongly, enforcement and regulatory, we get put in these positions, investigate complaints. We're down the middle. We're not for or against either party. We go on evidence. And the evidence says, we've given you the opportunity. We want you to voluntarily comply. We're trying to assist you. We're trying to direct you to comply. The only thing left now is enforcement. And that's what had to happen. So I think on one hand, it showed that council's prepared to do it, which is a good thing.
Is there a line? I could just imagine it on one side playing out of nanny state, Big Brother is watching you, we can't do anything anymore. But then on the flip side, there's people who are going, no, it's good that council has this power and can actually follow through, or even just that subliminal, oh, wait a minute, yeah, that fear of the environmental health officer stepping in because they can take you to court, they can issue fines or whatever. So it's that fine line from an environmental health officer's point of view of a little bit of fear is a good thing, too much fear is a bad thing, but then also just being seen as unnecessary control is a bad thing. Or, wait a minute, this is someone who's enforcing boundaries and that's what keeps big fences, whatever, make happy neighbours or whatever it is. And that concept of how do people live together in clear boundaries. So there you go. So Rooster Gate, dragged on for decades, escalated with the whole process going on, technology being dragged in, proof happening, documentation, ends up in court. Did the judge have a wig?
No, he didn't actually.
Oh, good. Okay, so I can't finish with the visual of judge in wig, gavel coming down, guilty. But yeah, and then now this breach. Rooster no longer a happy rooster, but did pass genes on to next rooster, and farmer still farmer, neighbours still neighbours, and Rooster Gate in the media. And hopefully it's finished there. In 3 years' time, we'll have Rooster Gate 2. The saga continues. We'll bring back all the big names. We'll introduce a couple more big names, and we'll have the sequel episode. But yeah, so Rooster Gate, that's it. So it's been revealed. Thank you, Tanya. And now I'm not sure where we're going to go on from here. What's going to be the next big one? So thank you very much, Tanya, for bringing us Rooster Gate.
Okay, thanks for having me.